Welcome back to Selling Circular, the podcast that explores the intersection of commerce and sustainability through the lens of circular economic innovation. Today, we're tackling one of the most ambitious global initiatives in recent years, the creation and negotiation of an international plastics treaty. I'm Gar Punnett, CEO of LoopLayer.
And I'm Sabira Lakhani, VP of Product at Reaply. Thank you all for joining us. We continue to interview entrepreneurs and industry leaders, and we're trying to uncover the strategies and real-world examples that businesses are integrating into their circular principles and their operations.
So if you know anybody that might be interested in this, circular economy, maybe even plastics, and we can bring them into the circular world, please tell your friends, your colleagues about our podcast, because we are trying to grow this little movement we got going on. That includes, talking about today, more of circular economy in plastics and all about, well, really plastics being one of the biggest innovations in our, well, we're post-plastic innovation, but of our generation plus the other generations. And how do we balance that? Is really the question. Do we get rid of it?
It's wild because I would argue it's one of the biggest innovations in the history of human history.
Yeah.
And
up there with the internet. And that's, I honestly probably, maybe gasoline. Like that's what we're talking about.
Yeah,
even
that,
the
even other side of fossil fuel. Yeah, it's always,
the other,
symptom
exactly.
of gasoline. But yeah, the benefits comes with the griminess of it.
The trade-offs, yes.
If it's such it has changed our lives for the better, but also lives within our bodies, lives in our waterways and our landfills. After getting a dog, Gar, I always cared about, not always, the last 10 years, I've always cared about garbage. And now it is way wilder to know the amount of crap that is on the literal ground. And I'm in a well-maintained apartment complex.
Okay, this is also Callie's biggest beef. And she's going to love that I name drop her. She said the same thing about our neighborhood, that you don't quite fully realize the amount of trash you have in your neighborhood until, in your city, whatever your community is, until you're walking a dog and having to take it out of their mouth.
It is every walk that we go on, there's new plastic, chewing gum, but like push pins. My dog is eating push pins that are on, why is it even on the ground? Pills. We found a pill that was full, and my brain is just, and Omar, we'll name drop Omar too, but his eyes are also now way opened and very frustrated with the world. And it's just like, how does it get here?
How does it get here is the question. And how do we take it away? Which is ultimately, that's what we need to figure out in dealing with the symptoms of this innovation that we've created. Just as much as we might be reeling from how do we deal with social media, how do we deal with plastics? And this is not an easy answer. But as we speak, nations around the world are actually gearing up for their fifth meeting called INC5, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee number 5 in South Korea, which is the next crucial step in a 2-year dialogue aimed at addressing the global plastic crisis. This treaty, reminiscent of the Montreal Protocol that successfully tackled ozone depletion in the 90s, seeks to create a framework for reducing, better utilizing, and controlling the economics of plastic, a versatile yet problematic material that has become a significant environmental concern for all of us. So, the stakes are high, and with projections suggesting that by 2050, we've all heard this, that there will be more plastic than fish. Maybe not all of us have heard this, but more plastic than fish in our oceans. This treaty represents a monumental effort to bring together diverse stakeholders from oil and gas producers, and at the same table, bring environmental activists in a bid to reshape our relationship with plastic and hopefully create a more sustainable future.
I know that meeting culture has been under attack in general in like corporate and startup world. So I can't imagine what international meeting culture about plastic with these stakeholders in the room would mean. But to help us unpack that uh, and understand also the broader landscape of plastic in the circular economy, our guest, James George, is joining us in this episode. He is formerly from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is a independent consulting and think tank organization. And James now consults in circular economy strategies, and he has a lot of experience in facilitating these kinds of meetings where you have multi-stakeholder dialogues across geographies, and you're really trying to drive systems change, which is really fascinating too. We got into the nitty-gritties of how it actually works, which was really cool. So we heard from James and his wealth of insights into the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead for us in building a more sustainable world. So please join us as we delve into these intricacies, and we can also learn more about the role of technology and how we can push the world into embracing these kinds of circular principles so we can overcome our environmental challenges.
Embracing meeting culture to the max to solve plastics. Yes.
We gotta try. If we don't try, we're definitely gonna fail.
Not on our watch. Enjoy the interview.
We're gonna try.
But I want to start with the positive. Around our treatment of plastics in the conversation of circular economy. And I'll leave it open-ended. I want to see where you take this, because I know this is where we could start to really dive into some things that we're doing well, but then some critiques here.
So it's interesting focusing specifically on plastics because, of course, incredibly tangible. We all know what plastics are. Again, the word covers a multitude of sins. So there are different types of plastics. Like not all plastics are created equal. But we find ourselves currently, 2 months out from INC5 in South Korea, which is the final, although there is rumors there might be an INC6 because people can't reach agreement.
Yep.
The final conversation for the Global Plastics Treaty, which has been running for almost 2 years now, this dialogue. You know, for those unfamiliar with this process, probably recall people talk about the Montreal Protocol, which was, back in the 90s, I think, which was around chlorofluorocarbons, so CFCs, when the world came together and said, that invisible stuff in the sky that stops us getting sunburn has got a hole in it, and it's got a hole in it because we're releasing these harmful gases, and they exist in fridges. And actually, they cause skin cancer when the ozone gets depleted. So that's a pretty good leveler for everyone to come together and say, hang on a minute, we all get affected by this. Let's try and do something about it. So we had the Montreal Protocol. It was the first time we ever came together to create a ban on CFCs and a reduction on these ozone-depleting chemicals. And we're trying to replicate that with plastics. We're trying to replicate the removal, reduction, better use cases, control, economics around this incredibly versatile, incredibly important material, which actually we've built a broken system around.
Yeah.
That's why plastic is a waste. Or a waste material. That's why it's showing up in our environment. That's why you see it stuck up turtles' noses or around the necks of seals and dolphins, because we don't attribute value to it once it leaves our homes, once it leaves our businesses. It enters the ecosystem and the economics don't stack up for us to do anything with it. I'm oversimplifying.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Difference between single-use, multi-use, durable plastics. But we have this moment that the world is coming together to try and solve, or at least agree on a framework of definitions, hopefully reduction targets, hopefully some of the challenges around the marine environment, so that we don't end up with more plastics than fish in the sea by 2050.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of positive, but the negative to that is we're not there yet. And it feels like we're quite a long way off, which is why I think people have been talking about maybe there's an INC6. And the reason we feel like there's a long way off, because of vested interests, because of the status quo. very glibly, when we think about the fossil fuel industry and our attempts to move us away from fossil fuels, the oil and gas industry see 40% of their income for the next 10 to 20 years in the production of plastics. So as we start to decarbonize our energy and our everyday lives, the delta that those companies, the stranded assets that they have, the investments that they have, 40% of that will be compensated in continuing to churn out plastic over the next 10, 20 years. So we have we have a massive industry making billions, if not trillions of dollars every year that is at risk. And I think they see plastics as the answer. And the only way they see plastics as the answer is if we continue to use it in this throwaway culture.
Oh, that's so interesting. So you've got vested interests that are going to entrench around their financial future of saying, okay, if we're divesting from this from a transportation and maybe other heating and cooling aspects of our culture and our economic needs, this is where we need to maintain our bottom line.
Yeah.
Is that what the difference, if you were to guess, I guess, or I guess hypothesize, is that the difference between what we're dealing with now in the negotiations and maybe the boogeyman's of yesterday, which is everyone was kind of like, oh, maybe this is technology in terms of these hydrocarbons that are being phased out, and everyone was kind of maybe willing to say, all right, maybe we could phase it out because maybe there were other technologies that they could say, we'll work with this instead, and so it was much easier to come to the table on that.
I think it's an interesting point. I think that latter point is still there, but the energy is now focusing a little bit around the former. And where I see that showing up and why I take that perspective is one of the key tools we have to change our direction and our path on plastics is reduction targets. If we think about when the plastic is created, it's created because it's got to deliver a need. The problem we have is once it's delivered that need, it just disappears off. It either goes into the environment, it goes into the ground, it gets incinerated. Some of it, less than 2%, is captured and potentially recycled, or and reuse models are an area where we can start to increase that level of cycling of material. But the biggest lever we have is reducing making it in the first place. Every piece, again, oversimplification, every piece of plastic that has ever been made still exists, right? Okay, some's been incinerated, it's changed format, it's degraded, but the vast majority still exists.
Borderline insignificant has been...
Borderline insignificant
has been dealt with, yes.
Over the last 70, 80 years. The recycling symbol has been around for 50 years, but we still only closed loop recycle out of all material about 7 to 10% globally. So we're not recycling our way out of this problem. So reduction targets are our biggest weapon. How do we turn off the tap? You will have seen from INC4 and the previous conversations that kind of art installation of the tap and all the plastic pouring out onto the floor, and you see the memes and the images that do the rounds on LinkedIn and other platforms that it's turning off the tap, it's pulling out the plug, and it's mopping the floor. Reduction targets is turning off the tap. It's stopping more of that material which we don't circulate within our economy coming into the economy when we haven't dealt with all of those downstream and other challenges. And the tension here is always, I think, we have two solutions or two states we need to solve for. One is the stuff we see in the environment today, the stuff that's on our beaches, the stuff that's in our waterways, the stuff that's in our supply chain, the stuff that's in our food, that's in our blood, that's in our unborn children, that's in the clouds, it's in Antarctic ice, Arctic ice. We've got to deal with that problem. And then the other problem is, how do we stop repeating the problem? And those are two very different and at times very discrete solution groups. and they don't always complement each other. So I think some of the tension is when you think about plastics and the problem is where do you put your energy and your effort? And sometimes it just feels like you can't do wrong for doing wrong, right? It feels like almost like an impossible problem.
How are you getting people to the table? How are you helping in this effort? In that, what is then, I mean, strangely, I almost said hostage negotiation. It feels like it. I mean, it feels like someone's got something they're guarding
Yeah.
with all the energy, and I mean, it sounds so aggressive. We're not trying to take it. We're trying to say, hey, let's figure out new solutions here. But it is that tension. And you mentioned that already. That tension's real.
Yep.
How do you advise? How do you help? Without naming names and specific things you're doing, we can talk in maybe some vague concepts. But I would love to. How do you help this?
There are a couple of specifics in here that I think would be useful to talk about. So what you've described there is systemic change, right? It's messy, it's complicated, it's nebulous. The problem feels too big. You know, you pull one lever, and 3 months later, another 2 or 3 move in the opposite direction, and then you're back to square one. Part of that global treaty for plastics means that every country comes to the negotiating table representing both the interests of the companies that operate within their borders, but also the perspectives and opinions of the activists and what you might call upstream, midstream, downstream, and kind of academic perspectives. In the UK, and I'm assuming this happens everywhere, but in the UK, what we're doing is, as a precursor to those meetings, INC5 in November in South Korea, we're mutually convening, I must add, the plastics value chain to inform the government's position on what they should be negotiating on. So very specifically, what you're doing there is you're bringing the oil and gas producers, you're bringing the chemical companies, you're bringing the brands and the retailers, the recyclers and the waste managers, and then the academia and environmental NGOs together. And you're saying, we know you guys down here hate those guys up there. And we know you guys up here have some very, very well polished lines to take and why this is the right thing to do. But actually, you're all part of the problem, but you're all part of the value chain. So we need to understand, in this context as UK PLC, what do we need to push hard on? What do we need to negotiate further on? And actually, what doesn't necessarily apply when we balance all of the economic, social, and environmental issues when we think about the treaty. So that's one of the very specific things that I'm involved in and doing here in the UK. It's how do you bring a balanced conversation? Because these people aren't evil per se, and I'm talking about the kind of upstream element, but you need to get their perspective because they are part of that system. And if you want that system to change, you can't just rage at it and tear it down. Because guess what happens if you don't have an alternative? It pops back up. It might be called something different. It might look something different. But if it creates value and economics in the same way as it has done for the last 300 years, guess what's going to happen? Exactly the same. So you've got to bring those people together, and then you've got to create a way for everyone to be heard and then everyone to be challenged. My hardest part in that conversation is not letting my own bias influence the conversation, not leading the witness. When a oil and gas producer says something like reduction targets will hurt the social fabric of the UK economy, you have to really resist from calling out bullshit, and actually allow them to get their point across and then to be debated. And I guess that is the point. You want a grown-up conversation about this because this isn't an overnight fix. This isn't a short-term, one technology, one decision, one business model solution. It is a spectrum, and it is a very broad spectrum. And then we've got to take everyone else with us. So notwithstanding those who are in the value chain, how do you take the public with you? How do you take everyone else who may not have direct impact in that conversation, but is impacted indirectly. And then how do you try and keep it objective? Because this is incredibly emotive, especially when you get the likes, and I don't mind naming them because I'm sure you get the likes of WWF and Greenpeace and Surfers Against Sewage and Plastic Free World and all the rest of these folks. It's a passion, it's an emotion. This material is, for the most part, bad in the way that we use it. So how do you balance that conversation? It's tough.
I love that because essentially what you're also trying to do is just keep everything at a low simmer. We want a little boil, we want
Yeah.
a little heat here so that we can make
Yeah.
something happen, but it's just can't let it boil over too much. Everyone can bring some emotion, bring some talking points, but keep it nice and consistent.
And we've started with plastics, but you could almost pick any of the polycrises we're facing, right? Since finishing at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, where for 3.5 years I lived, breathed, immersed, sweated circular economy and how you talk about it and how you don't talk about it. Since leaving EMF, I've found I only see the world in circles, but I talk less about circular economy and more about transformational change. Because that's what we're trying to do. In this example, we're trying to get businesses, organizations, individuals to do something different today than they did yesterday. And we're hopefully trying to get them to do something different without realizing and still being able to satisfy, rightly or wrongly, that profit growth agenda. So how do you wean people? Again, tear it down, it pops back up. How do you work with those organizations together? Now, the criticism to that, and I can hear people screaming it at me, is, yeah, but they're not changing quick enough. We're running out of time. This problem is just too big for us to solve, and we're going to hell in a handcart, and we've almost fallen off the edge of the cliff. And there are elements of truth in that, which brings me all the way back to your point about technology. And actually, what we have seen is huge advances in some downstream, but also upstream, technological solutions which start to create those economic models or replace the traditional economic models with ones that can work in the long term and can be competitive and commercially viable. And that I think is what is really exciting about this dialogue, is it continues. There is no solution. We can't find a solution, so people keep innovating. Eliminate, circulate, innovate. How do we keep going back to those three tenets? If you need plastic, if you need that material, then let's make sure it's the minimum amount we need. We're not using too much. If we then still need that material, is it the right kind of material? Is it a monomer material, or is it many different types of material, many different types of plastic, which means it can't be repurposed, recycled, remanufactured, whatever it is. And actually, if for whatever reason we recognize it doesn't have to be plastic, what are the other materials we should be looking at? How do we innovate to kind of change this problem? So it is complex, it's complicated, it's noisy, it's messy, it's brutal, but that's also the magic of the conversation. Because the opportunity to get this right, it's not game changing, it's life saving, right? The path we are on doesn't work. It has worked because we didn't know how bad the problem was. But now we know how bad the problem was. We need to do something about it. And I guess the biggest challenge, or the biggest thing we should all be doing, is calling out those moments, standing up and saying, I don't think you're right on the science there. I don't quite check your kind of sentiment about we need to keep producing more, because otherwise people are gonna, the economy is gonna collapse in developing nations, because the informal workforce is gonna disappear. If we hadn't created the problem in the first place, they wouldn't have to intergenerationally create an income from picking up our waste. So again, the problem today and the problem in the future, and the bridge for that for me is the technology.
I do want to come back to the technology, but while you're talking about the dialogue and conversation, for the people who don't get to be in those rooms, like I'm just trying to imagine, like, what are the power dynamics in the rooms? How are you actually like conversing, objecting? What are the agenda topics? Like from the start of the conversation to the end, like the week or the weekend that you all spend together in a room in South Korea, like what will that look like? Can you pull back the curtain for us and
Yeah.
like what actually happens?
So this is pre South Korea, right? So this is the UK context. It's in the UK. So the dialogues are over 2-3 weeks. They're split into 4 sectoral dialogues and then a group plenary at the end where we bring everyone together. And exactly to your point there, because if you put some very emotional people in the room, the only people you hear are the ones who shout loudest. Whether they are right or not, if they keep hammering their point, if they keep delivering their lines to take, there isn't space for other people to get their perspectives across. So typically over the last kind of 4 versions of this, through INC1 to INC4, it has been reviewing elements of the text and the documentation as it is laid down as part of the treaty process. And it is getting the perspectives from all of those different segments. So what we tend to do is, at the very beginning, is we will just bring together all the upstream oil and gas and chemical producers and just have a conversation with them and capture their comments, their thoughts. We use those kind of platforms like Miro and others to get their feedback into the document. How does this particular piece of legislation impact them? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And we do that with the 4 separate groups. So, of course, when you go through that dynamic, the perspectives are very different. They come from a position of, and actually more often than not, when you start engaging with some of the more upstream companies, they're more worried about who's in the room than what they say, because they don't want to walk into a baptism of fire. They don't want to walk into an adversarial, they're not interested in engaging in an adversarial conversation because they know that those 2 ends of the spectrum aren't going to see parity. So we separate them out. We give it an opportunity to capture the separate elements. And then when we bring together them on the plenary, we play back everything that's been said. And then we give other groups the option to comment on the other elements that have been captured. So it's a bit kind of peer reviewed. And again, back to that kind of challenging the bullshit and sort of saying, why has someone written this? The bigger problem is X and Y. I guess the beauty of doing it that way is you give the opportunity for people to show their true priorities, rather than not being adversarial or not saying something because they fear reprisal in public. And what it allows us to do is then capture that value chain perspective, pull out the trends, pull out the key figures, objections, reinforcements to the, and then that's what we can then give to the negotiators to say, this is what the UK economy is saying, the UK plastics economy is saying.
At the what I love in hearing this, and I would love your take on the difference. When you're going after this systemic change, you're bringing multi-stakeholder approach here. You're bringing lots of people to a table, and you're saying, hey, everybody, air out your priorities. Talk about your barriers, and this is where we can go to getting to where we need to go. This conversation, what I love about the title here of Selling Circular is it's, as we're always trying to figure out, how do you sell circular to consumers? How do you sell circular to your colleagues? How do you sell circular across different environments? You've also worked in a space where you're within companies.
Mm-mm.
These are now, you are all technically headed towards the same corporate goals, but now you're navigating your own internal stakeholders and your own internal. How is that different? How is it the same when you're having these types of innovative conversations, negotiating environments? Are there differences? Are there equivalencies of how you're bringing people to the table as different stakeholders, different corporations, different entities, or all actually technically within the same corporation trying to head towards the same goal?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'll try and unpick it as best I can. Before I do that, just I've been in the last kind of 15, 20 minutes, I've been fairly negative about the oil and gas producers. I will just say that.
Hey, we're not here to hate on that either. So
No, no. But I would just say, because actually, in the spirit of making sure we continue to have constructive conversations, how do we take
Totally.
it with the individuals that we're engaging with do care. They are trying to find,
Yes.
they are smart, excellent, well thought out individuals, but invariably they work for an organization whose business model is the transference of dinosaurs into plastic bottles, right? So it is, how do you square that circle? You don't. But that's
Yeah.
the system we live in, everybody. So
You
so
know-
let's kind of, just it's not all about being a hater, but how do you bring that technology, that resource, that income, that opportunity to innovate? And back to the technology point, that's where it comes from. It doesn't necessarily come from the kind of activism end. That has its place. It does. It's part of the spectrum of the solutions. But it's about getting those people to put across their perspectives based on the position they come from, and that's how you do it.
I love that you brought that up, because I think it's something, Sabira, I won't lump you in with my own naivete early in my career. But I think when you start to, and I hope somebody's hearing this and this will help them evolve. I do think there's an element that you have to maintain some amount of frustration and maybe anger that's a little too powerful with the status quo and the things that are holding us back from transforming into a lower impact economy. But early on for me, and I think what some people engage with, is they get sucked in because they're like, why isn't this happening? I'm so frustrated. I'm bringing all this passion and anger. Keep an element of that. But at a certain point, when you, like the three of us, when you start working with some of the largest corporations in the world, and you start to realize, oh, these are good people. These are good people that are trying to make a difference. They're trying hard to both put food on the table and do good.
Yeah.
Then it starts to contextualize a little bit differently when you're starting to work in the trenches of these hard topics.
Yeah, and it's the phenomenon of human nature a little bit as well, right? Like I don't mind saying I'm not a fan of Coca-Cola, for a myriad of reasons. But there is something between the individual waking up in the morning, putting on their shirt and tie and their shoes and their pants and heading into work, and walking under that brand barrier that then makes them part of the problem, not part of the solution. Whereas you see all these studies where 95% of CEOs say their environmental legacy is their biggest concern. And yet these are the CEOs that are not saying no to their bonuses, are not looking to reduce the negative impact that their companies are having. So what I'm always really, and I'm sure someone who's got a much better understanding in kind of human psychology and anthropogenics and all the rest of it, anthropology is kind of what changes in our mind that allows us to have a very grown-up, honest conversation at the breakfast table, but then vehemently fight that position when we're sat at our desk. And I guess that leads me to your kind of question, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably someone's children. Like it's probably being like, if I don't do this, someone else will, and I can't provide for my family. I mean, it may be that visceral, where it's like, this is just my purpose now to provide for my family. And I'm not saying that's an excuse, but I'm saying it's really easy to get to someone to be able to ignore some ephemeral, ethereal externalities that sort of exist into the future and say like, well, it's not going to help my kid get through school. And that's what's hard.
No, it's not going to pay the medical bills.
It's not going to pay the medical bills. Exactly.
It's not going to put fuel in the car. It's not going to allow us to do this. And I get, again, 25.
Well, your eyebrows raised on that, Sabira, and I know you're feeling like that's not totally fair for me to even support that idea.
but like 25% of all statistics are made up on the spot, right? But,
yeah. Well, yeah.
There's these kind of, you see these studies that basically say, and Gar, I think you and I have talked about this before, done 5-10 years ago in Walmart, 4,000 people surveyed. The questions were simply along the lines of, would you pay more for sustainable products or eco products? And 95% of people said yes. which then drops to 7% when they get to the checkout, to the till. Because what is the dominating factor? Cost. And for someone like me, that allows me to flippantly say, only bad choices in a bad system. If you can't allow people to make the right choices, you create artificial economic barriers to change. So again, back to that theoretical nebulous perspective of systems change. How do we only present consumers, individuals, us, with good choices, which is, the basis of a lot of the work around circular economy, making sure that it is also accessible rather than just the purview of those who can afford it.
Yeah.
Because that's not how we see systemic change.
I think that the systemic change, the root is actually in the investors, right? Because, or whoever is on your board, because when you think about that CEO, the decision maker under the brand banner, they're waking up and thinking, yes, I'm accountable to my children at the breakfast table, but when I'm at my desk, I'm accountable to the person who has hired me, and we're all hired by eventually the investor, the dollar, right? And so I think, how can the eventual conundrum is, how do we slow down as an economy to think and say we are going to systems change so that we can have what we want, but we want it in a better way? I think people don't know how to deal with, even I don't think I know how to deal with that tension, right? You're in a startup, you have investors. We're trying to bring circular economy products and technology and services to our customers who want them, but don't want them fast enough or aren't willing to pay enough to sustain the business for XYZ period that will buy us the opportunity to do what we want even dramatically more impactfully over it's just we're all accountable to the investor. So I heard on how do we build the system, but I think if we have to pick somebody to say you're in charge of the system, I think it's the investor.
I love that, because what it speaks to is the closest that we've gotten, and there are problems, but the closest we've gotten is ESG to changing the fiduciary responsibility of a company to the both economic and environmental, so that investors go, oh yes, this is the environmental, actually more just probably a placeholder for future revenue more than anything. It's almost it's not necessarily about the birds, it's about the money you could make if the birds still exist in 50 years. And I think so there's something to that. And we can all tie this back into, how do you get this conversation going internal to a company? Yes.
I just want to come back to Sprith just said there, because I think you're not wrong. You're completely right. But I think it's the investors, it's the politicians, it's the academics, it's the business owners, it's the consumer, it's all of us, right? It's top, middle, bottom, everyone in between, at the sides of it, because these challenges can be incredibly subjective. And I think everyone has a part to play, and that sphere of influence changes depending on what size of organization you work in, what products you are involved in, where you sit on the globe, and how do you make sure you maximize your own sphere of influence. I again, very simply put it as Coke or Exxon or Reapley don't have to solve climate change. The three of us don't have to solve climate change, but we all have a role in the machine that when we add up all of the sum of the parts, that's how we arrest climate change. So we have to trust that the others are doing their bit, and actually we're trying to influence the area we can influence as best and as impactful as we can. And that's how we start to shift the system. But you're right, follow the money. You've got to follow it. It's the economy, stupid, right? Circular economy, it's the economy bit. You've got to make the economics work, because if you don't, it falls down within 6 months, 12 months. A couple of years ago, everyone will know this story. Emmanuel Faber, who was the CEO of Danone, who were charging ahead in their circular economy strategy, got kneecapped, figuratively, not actually, by activist investors because they were going too hard on the environmental, and was booted out. And overnight, that wasn't perfect, but that leading FMCG light in circular economy was stubbed out because the investors decided they wanted to go in a different direction. So your point was, but how do you do this internally? It's a great question. And I guess I don't have an answer either, but the approach I use, I think, is not dissimilar to what we were discussing at the beginning of the conversation. If you are the CMO, the CFO, the CSO, the CEO, the guys and girls on the shop floor, the middle management, you have KPIs, right? You have priorities. You have drivers that you're weighed and measured by. And guess what? Circular economy probably isn't one of them. Sustainability might, on a compliance perspective, but is probably not what affects your end of year bonus. That is changing, but broad brushstrokes, folks aren't having their pay cut because they're not hitting their carbon targets yet. So the challenge for me, or not, the opportunity for me has always been, you've got to meet people where they are. You've got to use $3 words rather than $25 words. There's no point standing up here and telling people they're not good enough and expecting them to close that delta. You've got to go and meet them where they are and take them to where you want them to be. And the challenge with that is it takes time. It takes time. You can't, I don't think you can off the shelf it. You've got to build relationships rather than transactions. And back to that transformational change point, most of your barriers are normally emotional, not technical. That's how it's always been done. I don't want to change. The industry doesn't want to change. So it's unpicking and understanding where people come to that conversation. Again, back to that point about sitting at the breakfast table and then sitting at your desk. Where do they come from? And if you can understand that, you can unlock better conversations. And my job in that kind of messy circle is not to bring the solution, because those folks know their business much better than I do. My job is to get them to ask the right questions. And if they ask, pulling the thread very gently, it's, slowly catch your monkey, whatever phrase you want to kind of use, right? But it is to get folks to fall in love with the problem, make the problem smaller, and then see what they can do about it. What can they do today? What can they do in a week? What can they do in 6 months? What can't they do, and who do they need to work with in order to make that change? And that can be both internal and external. Someone that guy you and I both know, Mike at Google, head of circular economy at Google. He many times says, even at Google, we don't control the whole of our value chain, the whole of our supply chain. We can't do this on our own. Mike Werner, we can't do this on our own. We have to work with them. And sometimes that means working with folks who get it. And sometimes that means working with folks who don't, or don't know what they don't know. So it is a long drawn out process. It is like sometimes pulling teeth. But that's where you've got to lean in. You've got to go to the conversations where people don't get it, don't believe in it, don't think they can make money out of it. And you've got to convince them. You've got to influence them. So like that for me is the nub of bringing this topic and conversation into, it's the carrot, bringing it into the organization. And if that doesn't work, thankfully in this part of the world, there's a big EU monster pumping out legislation stood behind you like it's going out of fashion, from design to end of life to, EPR, plastics tax. This stuff is all coming online. It's all coming along thick and fast, which scares investors. It scares bottom lines. It scares market share. And so if the carrot doesn't work, there's always the stick.
And you were talking about technologies that you're excited about, and I wanted to come back to that as we start to round out the conversation. But what have you seen be successful in like the transformation of those conversations and the new technologies? You were starting to talk about like, how do you get the same function but less material? Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing as is coming to light.
Yeah, and that's by no means a small question. It's you could talk for days. But I think there is I think what is, if we go back to the kind of theory behind the circular economy, we live in an economic system based on 300 years of refinement. The outcome we see with our economy is a direct result of the tweak and the change and the efficiency that we've leveraged over a couple of industrial revolutions and the kind of evolution of the economy. So the outcome we see is as a result of that kind of 300 years. That translates for me into everything you see around you that's not part of the natural world has been designed by someone, right? It has been designed and it can be redesigned. But we don't have to wait another 300 years because of digitization, because of AI, because of all of those amazing technologies and advancements that have Uberized the world around us and put, what is effectively an entire supply chain and entire access into the palm of our hands in our smart devices. That, I think, is what's really exciting, because it's not going to take us another 300 years to redesign. We're able to do that. But then, very specifically, I'm a big fan of end-of-life strategies, because I think when you think about circular economy, when you get to the stage that people get it, they get it so far initially. And, it is sourcing the right material, it's transitioning to renewable energy, it's creating putting the best product onto the market in a system that allows it to stay in utilization for as long as possible. Where folks then start to fall down is what happens when that product is no longer useful, when it's no longer, valuable to be sold to a secondary or tertiary market, where it's no longer, reusable, remanufacturable, all of the kind of R's. That end of life strategy is something that many businesses don't consider because it's too hard, it's too difficult, which is where technology comes in. Now, there's a big pot of people who think if you grind something up or you return it back to its base molecules, that's better than putting it in the ground, which it is. But a lot of those processes are energy intensive. They use fairly harmful solvents and processes, and the places that they happen don't tend to be in built up areas. They tend to be in historically marginalized or kind of communities where people don't necessarily have the voice to say about that particular infrastructure that's pumping stuff out. So we need to use technology to focus on that end of life bit. There are some he's going to kick me because I can't remember his company name, but there are some great technologies out there about using biobenign technologies and biobenign solvents to harvest circuit boards, right? To harvest rare earth metals. Again, making up statistics on the spot. There was a study done quite recently in the US that basically turned out that there is enough lithium in the laptops and desktop computers that are in the homes and garages and basements of the US to supply the electrification of vehicles for the next 70 years. The next 70 years. That is a lot. Yeah, in 70 years, we won't be worrying about lithium, right? It'll be something else. But right now, the problem with, or some of the resistance you see to the EVs and the electrification is the conditions in which those rare earth metals are taken out of the ground, and actually the geopolitical instability of being able to predict that supply chain. So why don't we urban harvest? If we know for the next 70 years there's enough material in the US, how do we get that back? The only way we get that back is by making it easier for the consumer, more easy than putting it in the drawer or putting it in the bin. And the way we do that is digital technology. It's Uberizing the asset. I don't have to tell you guys current and previous Replay, right? That's how do you connect devices that sit in our cupboards, our sheds, our garages, and keep them in the economy because they have value. And the only way we do that is through IoT, AI, blockchain, all of these great digital technologies, but we need to educate people on them.
Yeah.
we need to convince them that they're not going to steal their data and turn their fridge off or stop their car driving. When again, you've got to meet people where they are and take them on that journey.
Yeah, I think that's sometimes too. It's funny about, and I don't mean this in any sort of disparaging way of those buzzwords, of that. I think I use some of them in my own language, and it immediately turns people off. They're like, "Oh, you're just like using," and it's like, actually, no. Some of these are deeply applicable to what is needed to connect the necessary dots in the system we're hoping to create.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, I'm excited about that future too, and I see that vision. I think we all do. For me, what I loved in this too is I think I realized that maybe the sexiest part of our jobs is really loving KPIs, OKRs, and project management.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's
It's the unsexy bit, right?
it's right. It's
The amount of times I use the words risk and due diligence and see people's
right.
eyes roll back.
Yep.
But those are the mechanisms that affect the change in the world we have right now because of KPIs and
Yep.
OKRs.
Yep.
I had a conversation recently with an organization that were trying to understand what should they focus on in 2025. And naturally, those conversations at some point come back to emissions. And so, as some companies are starting to do, they create an internal carbon budget. They say,
Yes.
right, we
Yes.
have this is the amount of emissions we produced at our baseline at 2019. And actually, we're going to take 80% of that budget, and that is our carbon budget for operations and delivery for the next year. And each department is going to have a fraction of that budget, and they need to stay within budget. And quite rightly so. And where we are right now, the companies that are doing that are incredibly aggressive because of the traditional KPIs. But the fact remains that one of the individuals said to me, "But James, at the end of the year, if I've hit my carbon budget, if I stay within my carbon budget, but I haven't hit my economic budget, I'm not working here the next year."
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Because I've been saying,
Yep.
and so going all the way back to the top of the conversation, I'm really hopeful and really glad that we're having those conversations because it means this conversation's kicked on a lot more than where it was 12 or 18 months ago. The downside is we've not quite got there yet. We're not quite operationalizing it. We're not making it real. And those traditional KPIs are still winning.
Yeah.
And I'm very mindful of time. In the UK, on average, for an average company, an acceptable level of growth each year is about 7% profit, right? So that is a reasonable year. It's not a great year, but it's a reasonable year. So how do you make this real? How do you make this, put it on the balance sheet? What if you said to the CFO, right, last year we made 7% profit. This year we're projected 7% profit. But what I want you to do is 5% of that profit comes from conventional construction, manufacture, selling. And 2% of that profit for this year has to come from circular or sustainable products. And your ambition over the next 10 years is to turn that 2% into 7 and that 5% into 0. And until we get it on the balance sheet like that, we'll keep spinning our wheels in the ether. We need to make the economics line up to what we're used to and then transition over time. None of this work is going to happen overnight. We need a 10-year, 50-year, 100-year strategy to be able to say, that's where we want to get to, but there are some clear technological, policy, cultural, emotional barriers that we have to unpick, and that's going to take time. And we need to be okay with that. We just got to make sure that the general direction of travel is in the right direction.
I love that hopeful message. Again, conversation, we're at the table, realizing that it is not just our own singular projects. We're not going to be the only ones working on it. And I think it was a maturity there was a maturity growth point for me, not just today, but just in general, that systemic change isn't going to happen from the thing I think about and make happen. It's going to involve so many people, multi-generations, continuing the work and passing it down the line and just keep that growth going. And that's how we're going to get to a compounded growth, circular economy solution. And so I think that's the fun part is we just got to realize we're all in this together. How
And
are
I
we going to
think
round this out? How do we round this out, James?
Well, I think also on that, right? We need to strip out our glossary of terms because we use those words, and I've just done it for the last kind of 50 minutes, right? Systemic. That doesn't mean anything to my parents, right?
True.
You know,
Right.
it's so how do we talk about it in a way that allows folks to engage with it where they are in the journey? Like you and I've discussed before, I hate the term expert. I'm not an expert. I think people who describe themselves as 30-year experts, my question is, what have you been doing for 30 years? The outside is still on fire. We are all learning. It's just some of us learn earlier than others. Our job is then to catch them up, is to
Yeah.
get, the boat raises all tides. We need to get everyone better equipped to understand the problem, how this is going to impact the way a product looks and feels, why the changes are being made, why you're making that demand on your supply chain, why they have to help you to help them to help you. We have to take people with us rather than standing on our little towers and going, we've got to be more circular, we've got to reduce and decarbonize, we've got to solve hunger, and we've got to use simpler words. We've got to use art and culture to inspire people in a different way. And if you can do that, let me know, because I'll use it in my pitch, and I'm sure I'll get much more work.
Excellent. You want to close us out, Sabira?
Well, I think you've already given us the message of being hopeful. So it sounds like we need forward-thinking design and technology, inclusive conversation, and patience and persistence over a long time so that we can bring the masses along with us as we go on this journey. So thank you for being here and for giving us this hopeful message and for pulling back the curtain on how these conversations even happen.
My pleasure.
It's the $1 words. That's what we need. It's the $1 words to get us to that action.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Thanks, Sabira. Thanks, James.
Thanks, James.
Thank you very much. Good to chat with you.